Look, thank you very much for having me today. It's a real honour to be here, and I'm delighted to be staring straight down the barrel of a table of ladies. Lovely to see you, and thank you for coming and supporting us. When I was asked to come and address this esteemed group of business people today, I did ask Mike Ulmert, who spoke to me, what would you like me to speak about? And he wasn't entirely sure, but something about women. And I thought I'd totally change up the presentation that you've just heard to something a little bit different, because my story is, I think, a very typical Australian Lebanese story, and I hope you feel the same. We've just heard from Paul on the post-COVID impact on the national and global economy. And as we work with the Business Chamber to try and help this country recover post-COVID, there is a natural hardwiring into the Lebanese people generally for entrepreneurialism, for resilience, for getting up, when it's down. And this is exactly that psyche that this country needs. And we need to play our part, which is a very valuable role to help it recover post-COVID. Now, let's see, back forward. Get my little clicker right. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. This artwork you're looking at, Tony and I commissioned for Buildcorp for our first wrap, our Reflect wrap, by a sports person, and you're going to hear a little bit about sport today. The first Indigenous Brownlow medalist, Gavin Wanganeen, was on a board that I was chairing for DFAT, and I came to know him. He was such a lovely man, and that's a very special piece of work for us. But who am I? Well, for the benefit of our Australian friends here, we're really precise in our language about how we say who we are and our introduction. So, in English, I'm Josephine Sukkar, wife of Tony, son of Yusuf Tufi Sukkar, of course from Sharri, where else? I am the daughter of Buddy McDessie, son of Yusuf Petrus Maetzi from Kfar Helda. But today, because we're among friends and a bit more relaxed, you can call me Jordan, the mother of Jordan, because he's here today and he'd like to hear that. So there you are. Look, I've got a couple of slides to share with you. I promise there's not a single graph or Excel spreadsheet, which I do like a good Excel spreadsheet. But what you're going to hear today is the intertwining of business, sport and family, which has been a generational thread through my story and journey. And a very quick rush through. We've all got one of these photos. That's my mum in the front with her parents, Deb and Manira Khalil, 1948, when they arrived from Kfar Helda. My grandmother was from the village of Douma, the home of Mari Bashir, if we all remember, the previous governor. 1952, the McDessie family, my grandparents, arrived with 11 children. They arrived a year later, in 1949, than my other grandparents, and they went pretty much straight to Newtown, and remain very fond of the area. And at this point I would like to speak about the role of governments in here. There was a very famous Labor federal MP by the name of Fred Daly. He was actually the member for Grayndler, which is the current area for our Prime Minister Albanese, is where he's from. And he saw this young family arrive, can you imagine, 11 kids, and wrapped his arms around them, directed my grandparents to the right schools, where to go to church, how to get themselves around, and help them set up a business. And what began as a small family business became a very big family business, Midford School Shirts. And if you were schooled in Australia, you were more than likely to have had a Midford school shirt, even if the label wasn't Midford. One of my holiday jobs with my cousins when we were all piled into the factory at Miranda in January in the lead up to work was to sew all the different labels on the shirt. Some were Midford, some were St George, some were St Joseph's Private School. That little business grew into 3 factories, one in Miranda, one in Kembla Grange down in Wollongong and another in Kuala Lumpur. I reached out to my cousins, say, have any of you got any photos of Midford? Remember the stuff our parents used to make us wear? And that was the best we could come up with. There's even a stock one. But my grandfather did something a bit later as well when he grew the business. He acquired a men's shirts business called Paramount Men's Shirts. Now, while my husband and I today are known for sponsoring sport and rugby union, over a decade before we began sponsoring rugby in 1992, my grandfather, so grateful to Newtown and the area which accepted and raised his family, became the major sponsor of the Newtown Jets. That's a photo of the 1981 team that went to the grand final. You're looking at Tommy Raudonikis in the middle, but check out Phil Gould next to him. They lost the grand final to the Parramatta Eels that year. And they're a pretty sports-mad family, but the most sports-mad of the McDessie 6 sons was hands down my father, Budder. From when he was at school at 4th Street, that's him there circled, the sort of bottom left there. He played every sport. I've got to be honest, I don't know he was the most coordinated or gifted, a bit like me. I'd never played a sport in my life, which makes the role I hold hilarious to my family. Isn't that right, Jordan? But he was the most passionate sports supporter, which my grandmother thought was just a waste of time and, was going to get in the way of stopping him from being a doctor. But it happened anyway, and there they are in 1961, my Sitti Amini and my aunt, actually, who's married to my Uncle Lewis, on campus at Sydney University, where he did graduate from medicine, but still played rugby while he was there at the University of Sydney. In 1963, my aunts tell a story that they were worried some nurse was going to pick him up and, take him off. So they tricked him and took him on a holiday to see a Lebanese family in Wingham, Dib and Manira Khalil from the village. And Dad went along and met my mother. And there they are out the front of Jiddu Dib's fruit shop and cafe in Wingham. Check the cigarette in Jiddu Dib's mouth and the advertising of the price of poultry on the window, leaving the shop to cross the road to St Mark's Anglican Church, where Father Wolfe from St George Orthodox Church flew up in the chartered flight. They had to charter a flight, there were so many McDessies, to Wingham to be married in that church. The Chief Justice, for those lawyers among you, Murray Gleeson, his father was the mayor of Wingham and performed the naturalisation ceremony for my grandparents and mum and her brother, and was the MC at their wedding in Wingham Town Hall. Mum and Dad subsequently moved to Sydney. Dad was appointed to Canterbury Hospital, and when I was born, I came home to a house on the grounds of Canterbury Hospital, which was the first home I was born in, because he was an intern and had to stay there. And while he worked and became a specialist and specialised, his love of sport never ever left. He became the club doctor for the Canberra Raiders when they established a team here in Sydney, and that's him in the middle. Look at a very young Wayne Bennett there, and a very slim Mal Meninga, and I think that's Sam Bacco, and I can't recognise some of the others. But he was right in amongst it. He was just obsessed with this sport. He was medical superintendent at Sutherland Hospital for 20 years, which meant that the Cronulla Sharks were his team that he was very passionate about. And the only time I ever saw him really troubled about watching any sports match was when Cronulla played the Raiders. Actually, this is a nasty one. This was with a Bellamy with a dislocated shoulder, a shocking dislocation actually, but that was his passion. But one of the other things he did was provide that example that his parents provided for him to service and volunteering. And when the Sydney Olympic Games were announced as being in Sydney, I just can't remember a time he was as excited about this, and so he immediately enrolled to be a volunteer doctor. And when he passed away in 2006, Mum said to all of us kids, "What would you like of your fathers?" And I said, "I want his Sydney Olympic Games, that god-awful volunteer kit they put them in that looked like they were dressed to go to work at Kmart," because it just meant everything to him and he protected it. And at the Sports Commission, we entered into a memorandum of understanding with Volunteering Australia last year, and they asked me why I volunteered in sport. And I said, because I followed my father's example. He was a Sydney Olympic doctor. And they said, "Do you have that jacket?" And I said, "Yes, I did." And I photographed, Tony photographed me in it actually, myself. And it's one of the most precious things I own of his because it meant so much to him. Volunteering was part of the hard wiring of what we did. As his father and his father-in-law both did before them, members of Rotary clubs and Lions clubs. Okay, So I share with you the interesting observations of family, my grandparents' sport, my father in sport, because when I met my husband, Tony Sukkar, it didn't surprise me and it was business as usual. He was doing this. He was a site engineer at Civil and Civic, which was then part of Lend-Lease, the Lend-Lease group, and he managed to get his job when he turned up to 3 interviews wearing his first 15 rugby blazer, which managed to get him through, and he played at a really high level, unlike my dad, same club, Sydney Uni. Here he is here with his team, and in there are a number of Wallabies, Nick Farr-Jones and his 2 brothers, Michael Hawker, Bob Edgerton, and so Tony was a good player. And interesting for today, Michael Hawker, the captain of that team in the middle next to Tony, the only one there with a mo, pick the lib, Michael Hawker and I are on a board together today. Washington hates old Pattinson, but rugby and business in my life seem to still be really closely intertwined. And Tony felt that when he finished playing rugby union that the behavioural competencies and skills he learnt on the field, being part of a high-performing team, were directly transferable into business for him, leading a large construction company. And because of that, he wanted to give back to rugby. So we began our business in 1990, and in 1992 we began sponsoring the club. So when the 3rd generation of son ran out for the University of Sydney, our son Jordan, he did it with Buildcorp on his chest, which was sort of quite lovely. And sadly, his little buddy never got to see that. He would have loved it. Dad was obsessed. In fact, the first time I went down to watch Tony play rugby, Dad came with me because I didn't quite know how to get there. One of the other reasons we enjoy participation in sport for our children is, while Jordan has an MBA, he will say to you it was his year as club captain was where he learned the other behavioural competencies about being a leader, leading people, leading teams, which is what he does at Buildcorp. He's been with us for 12 years and is general manager for one of the businesses. So, like his father, it's been extraordinarily helpful to him, and the business, Tony would want me to show you this one, has been sponsoring rugby for over 30 years. There you are. So I think you can see. Actually, there's a lot of sponsorship there. The University of Queensland, Melbourne, Sydney, women's rugby, Australian women's rugby, Wallaroos. Some other interesting ones there, which I'll come back to later, but I can't step back from the involvement of sport in my life and how good it's been to me. Now, in 1985, when I met Tony, he'd completed a Bachelor of Building degree at UNSW, and I'd studied science, as Hanan said, and I was working in medical research. We married in 86, and in 1988, Tony left Civil and Civic, or Lend-Lease, and took a job with Gervan Corporation. 1990 came around. I was heavily pregnant with said son over there, Jordan, and this happened. We all remember the 18.5% interest rates and unemployment as it was, and Gervan Corporation went into receivership. And Tony came home without a job. Now, he was 30 years of age, and I was 26, and we'd always spoken about one day setting up a construction company. I spent a bit of time with him at Civil and Civic, and I said we should do that one day, but didn't particularly want to set up a business in a recession or while I was 7 months pregnant and not able to help him as much as we could. But he took over an $85 million project. I don't know what that is in today. One of the bankers, is that 250 million or something? A really big project. Now, you imagine being that client. The client first said to Tony, Multiplex are going to do it and they would like to employ you in the team. And we had a conversation, and Tony said, no, I'll do it on my own with the team. Took 3 days to turn the project around, and that was the beginning of Buildcorp. Today, the company employs around 500 staff with turnover about 750 million and work just on the eastern seaboard of Australia. And we'd like to think, and we're very proud, that it is a typical story of hard-working business people, which we hope people think we are. Over 100 MBA awards, Deloitte Best Managed Companies, Employer of Choice for 5 consecutive years. The ATO have just awarded the business status of Justified Trust. We're the only builder in 500, we're in the top 500 private companies. 33 of those private companies have been awarded the status of Justified Trust, and we're the only builder. Over $8 billion in projects, award-winning safety and quality systems. I'm really proud of that. But that came out of working for a large corporate for a number of years, Lend-Lease, where we were given the training of how to set up how to have a corporate mindset, proper governance, proper processes and systems and their values, paying our taxes, doing the right thing, and it comes back to you, and we were. As part of being a good corporate citizen, and the business is 33 years old, about 10 years ago we established a foundation, a charitable foundation, because there's a really high suicide rate in male construction workers. And we said to our team, what do you want to support? Mental health, and so off we went. And this was a couple of Tuesdays ago at our home, where we had a dinner for 120 people who all paid $2,500, and that's our patron, Sir Peter Cosgrove, handing another $200,000 cheque over to Lifeline. They've received $1.6 million from the foundation so far. We'll make that $2 million next year. We've also just collectively distributed about 4.6 in the last sort of 8 or 9 years. So it's doing good work. But we've also invested in other pathways in the business, and it won't surprise you to know as rugby, this one came to me blindsided. When I took the role with the Australian Sports Commission, I can remember saying to the minister at the time who approached me, Minister Colbeck, I said, I can't take a role chairing the Australian Sports Commission because the perception of conflict, my husband's sponsorship of rugby, if he has to stop sponsoring rugby, I won't have a marriage, so there's that. And he said, no, we can manage that. And I said, okay, Tony, just don't sponsor anymore. And then one of my commissioners, Kurt Fernley, the Paralympian, arrived at a board meeting one day and said, I love that Tony, husband of yours. He's such a top bloke, sponsoring wheelchair rugby. I said, we don't sponsor wheelchair rugby. He said, well, there's Buildcorp on Riley Batt's jersey. And then I went, oh, Tony, do we sponsor wheelchair rugby? He goes, you said inclusion was important. So there's that. But I think as a company, we've worked really hard to invest in the pathways to ensure that we've got fair and equal participation for every Australian at home and in our workforce. So we applied our sponsorships and our sponsorship money to teams that didn't have any sponsors on them. This is the Australian Women's 15s team who didn't have a sponsor at all, which was bizarre. So we said, we're happy to help out there. We never imagined in our wildest dreams we'd be able to sponsor a national team. It's been amazing. But at Buildcorp, we also did work to reshape the game. We used not just our money, but our influence, our connections, our dollars, whatever we needed to do to try and make sure that we equalise the playing field for women and men wherever we went. And it was interesting because unbeknownst to us, people were watching the business, and I began to get approached for different roles. A final one on our sense of what inclusion is, and of course it's gender, and of course it's disability, and of course it's religion, it's everything. These are our cadets who are the undergraduates that come into Buildcorp, and this probably is the key indicator that tells Tony and I, our people get the inclusion message. That is like that group of people, they're like the United Nations. They're old, they're young, they're women, they're men, they're Jewish, they're Muslim, they're gay, they're Chinese, they're old, they're young. The teams pick them themselves, and that's what the organisation looks like. So it's one of our little signs that tells us that we've got it, we're getting it right, and our people get it. Back to sport again. Over the years at Sydney University, from when Tony started sponsoring the club, the business did, we used to go to every home game because Tony's friends were still playing, and I'd sit on the sidelines with the partners and the kids would run around, and it was a lovely way to spend a weekend. Then he'd start to invite a client or two to come and watch who he knew liked rugby, and he'd invite their partners and kids, and this thing grew to 100 people at every home game for about 15 years. And there were past players from the University of Sydney who I didn't really understand. Of course, you could see my dad was rugby league and all those league players were at our home. I didn't know anyone from rugby union. They ended up in corporate Australia because they were largely GPS schoolboys. They were watching Tony and I, just running our business, entertaining people, face painters, all the usual things that we do today. But this was a long time ago. And one of those people watching Tony and I was a man by the name of David Clark, the late David Clark, who was the executive chair of Macquarie Bank, one of the founders. And Macquarie has been our bank for over 30 years now, but for the business. But Tony and I became close friends with David Clark, and he was a great mentor to us. Unbeknownst to us, saw this young Lebanese couple, remember Fred Daly for Majid Yusuf back in Newtown? We found this at this particular rugby club. They saw a 26-year-old and a 30-year-old working really hard, putting some money into the club, Tony giving back, entertaining clients, and they just gently counselled and guided us. And one day David Clark came up to me and said, Josephine, he was a very proper, polished man, I'm going to ring your secretary tomorrow and I'm going to ask her to make a time for us to have lunch, and I want you to come to this lunch with an open mind, and I'll see you there. And because it was David Clark, I mean, who's going to say no to David Clark? I'm like, yes, David. And off we went. We had lunch where he ordered for me. It was that generation of man. And said, now, Josephine, I'd like you to consider joining the board of the Sydney University Rugby Club Foundation. And I was like, oh, is that it? I didn't know what he was going to ask me to do. And then I'm looking at him thinking, oh, David Clark is asking me to join a board. How wonderful. We would meet. I was the only woman, of course. We would meet in the Macquarie Bank boardroom. He'd order my lunch and my wine, sit me to his right, ring me the night before every board meeting to make sure I understood my board papers. It was just a foundation. It really wasn't. But, he did. He cared about me feeling secure and safe in that boardroom. Very quickly after that, a number of opportunities came for me to join listed boards, ASX boards. The first one was a trust company by a man who was a follower of Sydney University, and I met there, who happened to be the chairman of the board. Another rugby board, I see it on at the moment, I call it a rugby board, Washington H. Sol Pattinson, a chairman who knew me through rugby. This is the one Tony's captain, Michael Hawker, was on, who went on to captain the Wallabies. And of course, Growth Point, a majority South African board. They're mad about their rugby union. Where's Josephine Sukkar? So 2 years ago, I became the first woman to chair the Australian Sports Commission. And for our overseas guests, the Australian Sports Commission is the government agency from where all the federal funds for high-performance sport are distributed. We run out of the AIS, the Australian Institute of Sport in Canberra, and last year I approached Olympian Kieran Perkins, who was at the time the CEO of the Australian Unity Bank, to apply for the role as CEO of the Sports Commission. This is the day we announced it to the market. Now, let's wheel back a second. For a woman who began life as a medical research scientist, daughter of Buddy and Mary McDessie from Wingham, in fact, Helder and Dormer, and sport has played a disproportionately large and influential role in where I am today, in somewhere where I could never have imagined myself, in the Australian business landscape and within government. And of all of the touching messages I received when I assumed this role chairing the Sports Commission, it was one from the widow of the late David Clark. She said, the late David would be so proud of you today, Josephine, and that meant more to me than anything else. My last slide, everybody, but my favourite. That's my dad and Tony's dad. We were in Lebanon in 1996, and it was when they were both with us. My dad under the grapevine there, in his village, and Tony's dad with his in his orchard in Pshadley, of course, the kids picking apples. I'm 5 minutes over time. This is where she speaks fast. Look, having born here in Australia and having no immediate family in Lebanon like Tony had, I wanted to take the children there to the villages of their grandparents with them telling the kids, this is where I was born, this is where your grandfather picked these, this is what we did. And I often hear our First Nations people here in this country talk about going back to country, because it's so helpful to young people if they want to thrive to know where they're from. These photos hang in our family room at home, and as part of the Lebanese diaspora, like our parents, we've tried to contribute to the economic and social vibrancy of this country. We've all heard from Paul, and as a country recovers post-COVID, this entrepreneurial spirit, this courage, of our ancestors and this ability to get up again and again. And I know at the moment for our brothers and sisters in Lebanon, they're getting a bit weary, but the diaspora is strong and we've got to show up and support them. So this country's been so wonderful to so many families, including mine. Our children are educated, they've got their own jobs and their homes. You know, mine and Tony's in particular. Jordan's sister's a doctor. We live in a politically stable and economically stable, country, and we understand our obligations to follow the examples of our grandparents and our ancestors and be good citizens, to pay our taxes, to play an active part in the community. So today, thank you so much for listening to me. This is another example of another Australian story, but I encourage you now to lean in heavily and dig deep into your own entrepreneurial spirit and your own hardwiring to help this country be everything it can be so we can help the country of our people. Thank you.